welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Bueno, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. Please join us starting in June for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it's essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. NARM provides a relational approach to addressing the current COVID pandemic and tools to support healing in the aftermath of this collective trauma. If you're looking for more advanced training in complex trauma and are working in mental health, healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Today's episode, we are having a conversation with myself, Brad, and Guy Macpherson. If you're not familiar with Guy Macpherson, you should definitely become familiar with him because he is a really great person and has been doing work in the trauma field for quite some time. With a doctorate in clinical psychology and with his project, the Trauma Therapist Project, the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and Trauma Therapist 2.0, Guy brings together resources for clinicians and therapists of all kinds who are starting out on their trauma-informed journey. Guy's inspiration comes from working with courageous individuals determined to learn and find meaning from the trials they have endured. For the last several years, he has dedicated himself to the study of trauma, post-traumatic growth, and most recently, the intersection of trauma and psychosis, specifically assessing and treating signs of early psychosis. His work helps individuals find meaning, strength, and inspiration after trauma. He does so by spreading awareness of trauma, helping educate and support and inspire individuals who are interested in learning more about trauma and who want to help those who've been impacted by trauma. So I hope you enjoy our conversation with Brad and Guy Macpherson. All right. So I am really excited about this roundtable discussion today we're going to have with Guy Macpherson and Brad Kammer. Hi, guys.
Hey, what's up, man? Thanks so much for having me, you guys.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. So for folks who have not had the pleasure of knowing Guy yet, Guy is the host of the Trauma Therapist Podcast. So we wanted to really kind of pick your brain and hear all your thoughts about the field of trauma. So no pressure, but you have to know everything.
Right. Okay.
And the truth is that you've been an inspiration to so many of us. So you've given such a service to the trauma field. I know so many of us are subscribers of your podcast. And so when Sarah and I were putting our podcast together, Transforming Trauma, we just knew that we had to have you on. So we're really excited to have you here.
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks. I appreciate you guys saying that.
I guess first, if you want to tell people a little bit more about who you are before we really dig into the questions, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, several years ago, I got my degree, my PhD in clinical psychology. And when I got into graduate school, I knew I wanted to focus on trauma. I was attracted to working with individuals who were kind of going through hell. For some reason, I felt like I could be there and sit and work with them, quote unquote, help them. And at that time, it was more of what was helping. I thought I could do something. And at the same time, I was kind of terrified. I went through graduate school and, went through my internships and found myself commuting a lot. I was always thinking about my clients, and just feeling like I didn't know what the heck I was doing. What am I doing? I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Why aren't they listening to me? I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I really can't do this. And at the same time, I was listening to a lot of podcasts. I was also going through a sensory motor psychotherapy training. So I had some hardcore trauma training under my belt, and still feeling, granted I was a really new therapist at the time, still feeling like I don't know what I'm doing. And, through certain experiences with certain supervisors saying, well, what makes you think your clients need to listen to you? I found myself thinking, well, looking at it in a different way. And, during these commutes, I was always thinking, wouldn't it be awesome if I had like what I conceived of like a master trauma therapist sitting beside me, could mentor me. And that's kind of how the podcast started, really to help newer clinicians kind of bridge that gap. And because I think there are a lot of people out there who want to help, we can go into what that means, but are hesitant, are intimidated for whatever reason, specifically around trauma. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to do. And I mean, there are more kind of tributaries off of that, but we'll start there.
Well, that was one of our first questions, is what was the mission of your podcast? And you said really to invite new clinicians to learn this information in a different way.
Yeah, that. And also, in one of my recent employment was at a clinic here in Northern California. We were assessing and treating young individuals who were showing early signs of psychosis. And 99.9% of those individuals had been impacted by trauma. And one of our jobs each day was to take these referral calls, from teachers, other therapists, and parents, and get the information about what was going on with this particular kid in most instances. And it always came back to, most often, they'd been traumatized. And it got to a point where I was like, what the heck is going on here? Because a lot of times therapists didn't think that they maybe should mention that, or didn't think that X had been traumatizing. And parents a lot of times just didn't have the thought that just because their kid was in a different room when they were killing each other, that might not have been traumatizing. Right. So I was like, what is literally like this? What is going on? There needs to be, we got to get this out there. So that was another part of it, just to get more information out there, open up a discussion about trauma.
Yeah. I think that's a lot of what really inspired us too, and is really at the base of our intention around the Transforming Trauma podcast, because it's so much of this is really about service, and we're living in a world with unresolved trauma. And we can see it on the macro, we can see it on the micro. It's just so many people really can be supported by this information. And the more we kind of lock it behind the gates of the therapists and academia and stuff, I love the trauma-informed kind of approach, because it's like really bringing it into all these different areas. So not just in psychology, but also in schools, in prisons, in public policy for parents, and all these different ways. So again, I've been inspired by the way that you're doing that, because you are bringing these experts in, but you're also kind of like lifting the hood and helping kind of just general public understand more about how they can be supported by this information.
Yeah. I mean, Brad, a big part of this for me has been my whole process, because it's like an equation. It's not just for me. I'm saying this for myself. It's not just the client. It's that other part. It's you, the therapist. Yeah. And because when I got into this, when I was in graduate school, I thought, well, I just need to read book A, B, C, D, and go to workshop 1, 2, 3. And that was going to make me the best trauma therapist that I could be. Yeah. And I had gone to back to school later. So I was like 36 when I got into graduate school. I had been in therapy, I had done a lot of cool reading and was, thought I had that stuff nailed down, the self-awareness nailed down. And it's not that I didn't realize the importance of it, but I didn't understand the value of it and how integral it was to working with people who'd been impacted by trauma. Because that required me then to look at my own stuff, to look at my own trauma and how I was or was not dealing with it. And that was a huge kind of eye-opening experience for me. And then when I went on to later to work with those kids in that clinic, and we were assessing and treating those kids showing early signs of psychosis, I thought that, I needed to act a certain way or be a certain way, like a therapist should act. And I had this degree, and not that I was pompous, but that I needed to have certain information and I needed to do it a certain way.
We're told that in school that we should.
Yeah. And you can guess how the story ends. It didn't work. It didn't work out.
Right.
Yeah.
It didn't work out. And it was my discovering of that process that really opened my eyes to what it means to be able to connect and how to connect and the power of that.
I love what you're saying. And I always tell my students that you have to go to therapy. You have to be doing these things on yourself or you're not going to understand. And the ones that look at me with glassy eyes, I'm always so worried, like you're going out in the field and I am afraid of what's going to happen to your clients and to you. like you said, it was such a shock to you, this recognition of, it's ego, not like you said, you weren't going in there egotistical, but it really was ego that was keeping you from being on the same level as your clients, right?
Exactly. Because, let's face it, I think when someone walks into the therapist's office, more times than not, there's this implied dynamic,
Yes.
right? The therapist is up here in a sense like they know, of course they know more than I do, and all the things that implies and so forth. And, one of my guests said to me, and I'll never forget this, she said, your job is not, a therapist's job is not to take away, your client's pain. That's their journey. Who are you to think that?
Yeah.
And I was like, what?
Right.
What,
right.
Wait a minute, isn't this why I got into this field to help and so forth?
Right.
And that whole process of being willing and being able to look at, my own trauma and how being bullied when I was a young kid impacted me, and as other people have said, it's not that means once you get into a therapist situation, you're not going to be triggered or you're not going to have of course you are, but being able to deal with that and manage that and, utilize that, so forth. So you guys got me going already, man.
Yeah.
Great. One of the things I'm thinking about, we talk a lot, when we're looking at complex and developmental trauma, is this piece that you mentioned about the unequal dynamics. So like clients come in and they generally do look at us either consciously or unconsciously as part of the medical model. And it's like we're holding a certain kind of knowledge, a certain kind of treatment that we're going to do to them. And what we talk a lot in NARM about is that in itself is a reenactment of childhood trauma, that we were helpless children to a world, maybe parents, maybe adults or teachers or whoever, community, that were doing or not doing, in certain cases, things to us that were not working for us. And so when here 30 years later, 40 years later, they come into therapy and the therapist, kind of is hearing and attuning to them and hearing about their distress and immediately pulls out this model that they think is the right thing for their client, they are in some ways reenacting a doing to the client. And then that sets up a certain kind of response in the client. I always talk about my two kind of idols in the world are hospice workers and midwives. And it's like, those are the people that really learn how to just be in presence to support people, like you said, to be in their own process. And I think it takes a very special person that's able to kind of do that work for themselves. And also, like Sarah mentioned, like an unlearning of a lot of what we've learned in not only graduate school, but the popular culture, all the trainings we go to, a lot of the books we read, the journals that come out. And I think that this, for relational trauma, is such a critical piece that you're bringing up.
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate what you're saying. And, it brings up the thought for me that especially, everything you said is true across the board, but I think really especially for people who've been impacted by trauma, because all of those things in a sense have been taken away from them, especially when you're speaking of complex trauma, their self-belief, their self-worth, their safety, their idea of what it means to be a human in a sense has been torn apart. And if a therapist is able to go in there and, correct that balance, provide a corrective experience, that can oftentimes be jarring, certainly, but it also eye-opening too, and empowering. And that's very simplistic. And the thing that gets me so excited about this, I think, is because there's this whole element of, being a human being with someone else and just how powerful that is. And the thing, I thought that was too simplistic. And when I first when I was in graduate school, I did. Come on. Of course, that's what it is. Well, it's not as simple as that, because it requires, like you're saying, Brad, these hospice workers and midwives, et cetera, it requires a certain beingness, which isn't always easy. I mean, it certainly wasn't easy for me. It also requires people to really look at why they're doing this. Why are you a therapist? Because I got into it because I wanted to help people and help prevent other people from being bullied, but that certainly wasn't conscious when I got into it. And the fact that it wasn't unconscious really impacted how I was in the room with them. And
Exactly.
that can be a problem.
Yeah.
And that that has been a huge piece of unlearning for me going through the NARM training, recognizing just how much I get in the way because I want to heal people. I want to fix people. I want to take their pain away. And I've watched myself, shift from addiction to trauma work. And initially when I started working with addiction, I had the, I've got to save you and doing all these codependent things and getting in the way. And I've developed a tolerance for that now in addiction. But when my trauma clients pop up, I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I used to do with addiction work. I'm seeing it now in trauma, and it's all my own stuff. And it's so humbling.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, this is the part of this whole discussion that really excites me, and it's what I like doing on the podcast. And Brad, quite frankly, it's what I really liked about talking to you, because you were kind of like a breath of fresh air. It's like I didn't have to dig in and get all this. You were
Right.
you kind of exuded that. I really appreciated that, and I'm
Mm.
not just saying this because I'm on your podcast.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's, for me, I can just tell you about my intention is it really comes from this grassroots in two directions. Grassroots in the sense that it's all going to be coming from our clients and from our community, but also grassroots in the sense that I have to walk the talk, right? I mean, certainly all of us have had experiences with really amazing teachers and therapists and stuff, but for me, the transparency piece, the relational piece is so critical. And I think you can be an amazing surgeon, for example, but not people don't feel safe around you. They don't feel like you're going to be a good healer for them. And I think some of this really is about us, like you were saying before, about really traversing really scary territory for all of us, is this really deep stuff in all of us. I'm a firm believer every human being on this planet at this point has unresolved developmental trauma. And, it comes in a wide spectrum of how that shows up. And the social problems we're having, the family problems we're having, the personal problems, even the medical. Now we have all the research on the ACEs study about how that leads to medical issues. And if we can't do the work inside ourselves, I just think it's really not going to go in the way that we really hope it will. And so, again, it's the thing that I was also attracted to both of you about is the sincerity and also just showing up not in our roles, but in our humanity. The reason why I was so attracted to NARM is because of this piece of intersubjectivity, that it's a big word for just like, how do we just show up as two humans and supporting our clients to reconnect to the humanity that they had to disconnect from because it was too unsafe to stay connected to their authenticity.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we're not just talking about, doing our own work and how great that is, but within the context of working with someone who's been impacted by trauma, the other piece is having that clinical knowledge, having that clinical expertise to be able to navigate the steps that you have to take, right? It's being able to utilize your own work, and
Yeah.
within the context, I call it like the trauma circle. When you're working with someone, stepping into that trauma circle,
Mm.
it's being able to know when to do X, Y, or Z, right?
Mhm.
Intervention and so forth. That other piece is super important to, obviously.
Exactly. And Sarah, you made a comment to this before, but it's like, what gets in the way of us knowing when to use those interventions, those skills, is usually our own stuff. In my teaching, I give this example. I don't know if you remember this, but in the 90s, they had these books that were like these 3D images that you would like look at. And then if you looked long enough, there would be like a heart
Mhm.
or a tiger that would pop out of the background. Do you remember those books?
I do.
Yeah. And so I could never see those, by the way, because I would look too hard. I would strain. But I really realized that, yes, it is about like really embodying the learning about how all these skills work and how to understand the nervous system and how to work with trauma. But the less I'm in my own way, the more I'm quiet internally when I'm sitting with the client, the more I actually see. And it's like when I'm starting to think about the client and what I should say next or what they said to me or how that makes sense, it's like I'm missing so much information. And I really have learned that so much through my mentor, Larry Heller, Dr. Heller, who created NARM, because there's a quietness that when we can really reach that place inside and quiet that noise, I can be so much more effective. It's unbelievable.
Mhm. And when I'm quiet, That's what happens with the client. I literally had that happen last night with a client who's I only see him once a month, so he's not like really quote unquote getting NARM yet within himself. That's what he says. And in my head, I'm running through all of the pillars, I'm running through all of the interventions. And then I just like got out of that and was with him. And then all of a sudden agency appeared and we were able to be in this quiet space together. That's exactly what happened.
That's beautiful.
That's exciting. I mean, for me, there was a lot of fear, and I didn't realize it at the time, but there was a lot of fear of being with myself, period, because that quiet means that for me, it was easy. And I think for a lot of people, it's easy to fall back on page, 222 of so-and-so book, and have that memorized. And, next week I'm going to go and utilize that with this particular client. Because the other way, and what you're talking about, being with oneself means that, and being able to be quiet with oneself means that, and being able to manage that within the context, right, means that there's been a certain exploration, a certain excavation, and certain work done. And that requires, oftentimes, I think, a lot of courage. Because oftentimes we don't want to go back and see what happened or what is happening or how our story has played out and how that defines us. That's what happened with me, and I'm not saying I've achieved some Zen master state, by no means, but it's gotten to the point where I don't feel like I need to have answers. And when I was working with those kids, it clicked for me. It clicked because the other way wasn't working. When I had my proverbial therapist hat on and my, proverbial attaché case filled with all my interventions, right there. It was baloney. It was crazy.
I was going to say one thing that I also really, really appreciate about your podcast is that I think you might, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you start with this at the beginning of your interviews. You ask about a mistake, a clinical mistake and these are like worldwide experts, and you're asking them to be vulnerable from the very beginning, which is just a really cool thing and a brave thing for you to do. But one of the things I love about it is, and Sarah knows we've talked a lot about this together, but it's like, that one of the things that we do with experience is, particularly if we think it's supposed to go a certain way and we make a mistake, we use that information to beat ourselves up. We use it to shame ourselves, to reject ourselves, to, really kind of hate on ourselves in a really intense way. And I love that you're offering this and reframing it, that these learning mistakes, and most of your guests go in that direction. They say they were so glad that this happened to them. And I wanted to bring it up because for me, there's a parallel process of that question to this idea that trauma can lead in a direction of us really getting into a lot of distress, and it can ruin people's lives. And it can also lead to what we call post-traumatic growth, that if we relate to the trauma in a different way, that, of course, we never want to go through that experience again. You never want to get bullied again, but that allowed you to have this platform where you're bringing this passion into the world and helping all these people. And I just think that that's such a gift that you're bringing to our field and specifically to the trauma field. I really appreciate that.
No, thank you for saying that. That question, it's interesting that you bring that up because a lot of people respond to that. A lot of the listeners respond to that question. And it became very interesting to me because the theme started emerging of the mistakes, quote unquote, or errors, however, you want to label them. Most of the times they're not, oh man, I didn't get such and such intervention right, but it was about themselves and how they, for whatever reason, weren't able to show up or didn't show up or were scared to show up. And that really made me reflect on my own stuff and my own self. So people resonate with that, it's, I mean, this whole idea of, what it means to help and what it means to heal and who's doing the healing here was another learning experience for me because I thought, well, I'm a therapist. I went to school. I am helping you. I can help you. I can help you heal. Not that I'm a magician, but what about the client's own story and power and healing journey that it started before they got into the room with you? All these things I think really speak to the relational component. And that's one of the things I think in this field that a lot of phrases get tossed around, like authenticity and genuineness and so forth, which are great. But what does that mean to be authentic? What does that mean to be genuine? And again, within the context of, working with someone who's been impacted by trauma too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it really relates, from my perspective, the disconnection that happens through childhood is ultimately a disconnection from our own hearts. And we then are afraid the rest of our lives about being vulnerable, because vulnerability is an essential ingredient to be really connected intimately to another person. And so we get in this bind where we're really protecting against what we most want. And again, I just think it's so cool that you asked that, because we all want vulnerability on a deep level. When talking about trauma, like when major traumas happen, 9/11, whatever it is, people come together.
Yeah.
That's what you see. That's the initial response you see before things start to kind of implode after a few days. But initially, people come together because their hearts, when I went down with the somatic experiencing outreach program after Katrina, people were telling us all these stories about how people in Louisiana were so different. The whole community was different. People were letting neighbors, people they had never talked to, just, live in their house and eat with them and break bread in these different ways. And it was like something broke down. These strategies of protection broke down, and they were just living in heart connection and connected to their grief, connected to the anger at God or, what was going on. It was like there was these ways of just connecting again in this human to human level. And I think that, us who are working in the trauma field, in some ways, we do have a little bit more of a door cracked open to it, because we're working with people who have had this break inside them. And it gives us an opportunity for really meeting them in a more vulnerable way. And particularly, like you brought up this piece about, the relational piece of it, it's like how if we're connected to our own vulnerability and how we're relating to ourselves through these errors and mistakes and learning and stuff, then we can, again, I think teenagers are the best, they can sniff out the bullshit so easily. But I do think that even our adult clients, it's like on some level, they know when we're really meeting them and when we're not. And you can't learn that from a book. You can't read an attachment book and learn how to be attuned. Like, it really has to be this cultivation that we do inside ourselves.
Yeah, to me, I think, I've talked a lot about why this whole topic excites me. Another reason is it really, I feel like it requires you to like step off the tip of this diving board, because you don't know what's going to happen, and we're talking about vulnerability here. You almost can't know what's going to happen. And oftentimes when you're coming out of school, you need to know what's going on. You're just like clinging to certainty, and this is almost the antithesis of that. And it may mean that, you're not going to have an answer, or you're not going to know what to do, or you're not going to know what to say. And how do you handle that? There was one, if I may just share a really quick story that really changed things for me. And it was, when we were working with these kids, we had this assessment that was literally, it was 40 pages long, and it was this big, thick thing that initially turned me off. It's like, this is not why I want to do this. But, we would bring in this kid, and oftentimes we worked with a co-therapist. And we, in the beginning, I was reading this thing verbatim and, marking down what everything was saying. And you weren't connecting, and you weren't finding out what was really going on with these young kids. And at some point, I really remember, weeks where I would like be reading a book and like, okay, so next week I'm going to use this with that, Sarah, who's 13 or whatever. I know this particular intervention is going to work. And after doing that several times, I remember this one kid walked in, and we started the assessment and we started the questions, and he had been through multiple therapists, multiple, other clinicians, and nothing was helping. And we got to a point in the assessment where I had it, and I dropped everything. I
Mm-hmm.
dropped how I thought I was supposed to be. And I said, okay, look, just put this down. You've been to you've been to this clinician, that doctor, your parents. What are people not seeing? What are they not hearing? What do they need to hear? And it was a combination of just dropping all of my BS and phrasing something in a way that obviously wasn't the assessment in the sense, that allowed everyone in the room to sink down, and the relationship was like forged in that sense. And that, like, I'll never forget that, because I felt like I didn't need to know something. I didn't need to have the answer. But what was so important was just that connection.
Yeah.
I didn't feel like I needed to be anything but myself. It was enough.
And I'd love to jump in with a question, because as we're talking about the vulnerability of the therapist, I'm listening with the ear of a client who might be listening to this podcast, a client who might need, quote unquote, need their therapist to have the answers. So what would both of you say to that client who's like, wait, you can't be vulnerable. You can't be human. I need you to save me.
Well, my first thought is they're not, mutually exclusive. Just because someone's vulnerable doesn't mean they don't have the answer.
Yeah.
And the other thing is too, again, it comes back to what is healing, what is helpful. And that's something that hopefully would be discussed with the client beforehand. But just because someone has an answer doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be help. And whose answer is that? Who's coming up with that answer?
Right.
So again, vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean weakness or, not having an answer. To me, it means being very present and being willing to be present, and for it to be okay to not have the answers as if someone's a therapist and so forth. But this ability, I think, for a therapist or the allowance for a therapist to let it be known that the client has the power, is in the driver's seat, is really empowering and important.
Yeah, I think you said it so well. It's a great question, Sarah, too. And I mean, I'm probably going to say the same thing that you just said, Guy. But I mean, for me, the vulnerability is really the vehicle inside us to be present, to be open, to be curious, to be willing to learn, to be willing to see what's going on inside. Like that example you gave before about just dropping the assessment and just being curious and open and willing to know about the child's inner state. Not about what you need from them or what you think they should do, but really what's going on for them, and asking that and holding space for that. It doesn't matter if you're a child or an adult. We just have not had enough experience with that. So, I mean, I think that's how I'm kind of thinking about where the vulnerability is what allows us to kind of show up in a much more open way. And also, Sarah, you've heard me talk about this a lot, but we differentiate in NARM between states and behaviors. And so I think, with some clients, you can show up behaviorally more open, more sensitive, more heartfelt, more, leading with your empathy. And some clients, that's actually going to be counterproductive. And so behaviorally, yes, we might have to adjust how we show up with different clients, but ultimately the state of receptivity to be receiving another client's true experience really is kind of a vulnerable place, or an open place, whatever the word we want to use. So
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, it's very easy to imagine vulnerability as some like wet noodle, and it's certainly,
I don't know why that's hilarious to me, but I'd love it. Go on.
It's a good meme to make, Sarah, there.
Yeah.
Yes, I will.
that having that self-awareness within this whole, again, I think it's really important to bring this discussion back always to we're talking about something very specific. In my mind, we're talking about, what it means to be working with someone who's been impacted by trauma, and what is involved with that. In a different context, certainly it couldn't be different, but that is a really good question, because I would be very curious about what vulnerability meant to that client. And if it's a negative thing or a weak thing, that would be very interesting to explore.
Yeah. I mean, also so many kids who experience developmental trauma, it was because their parents or their environment didn't have it together. And so if you come in and you feel like your therapist doesn't have it together, then that in itself could be another kind of triggering for it. And so that's why I think it's important to differentiate between the behavior and how we show up versus the state, because I would like to think of myself when I show up as a therapist that I'm actually very confident, that I really feel like I'm pretty confident in my knowledge and my skills. And that becomes kind of a bedrock for then how I can surrender myself to be even more open, because I have that confidence, in that those two things aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I think they actually can reinforce each other.
Right. Yeah. And again, this is where the experience of a therapist comes into play, the skill of a therapist comes into play, the timing, being open, being courageous, being fearless, being willing to be creative, to being able to trust. That was a big thing for me too, having self-trust in my own beingness, and being able to stand on that edge of that diving board, in a sense.
Yeah. Guy, what trends have you noticed about trauma work, the field, since you started the podcast?
I've made it a point to bring on people from a variety of backgrounds. And one of the things that has come up for me is an appreciation for specializations, but not to the exclusion of relationship. I think more seasoned therapists are appreciating the importance of specializations, but not to the exclusion of the importance of the relationship. Because I think it's very easy to feel that, X modality is the end all be all, or Y modality is the end all be all. But, being able to forge and create a relationship is foundational, especially to work with people who've been impacted by trauma. I mean, that's one of the themes that keeps coming up. I think another one is how important it is for people to honor themselves and to find out what's going to work for them, given the fact that there are so many modalities out there. Newer clinicians, where do you start? How the heck do you pick and choose from all these different modalities? And one of the things that keeps coming up again on the podcast is, I might have someone on who's been practicing EMDR, and they might say, well, you know what, that's great, but if it's not going to resonate with you, it's certainly not going to resonate with the client sitting in front of you.
And it's interesting that what you're sharing it sounds the opposite of what I know my students are learning in classes in grad school, because, they're learning all these evidence-based practices, and I don't know that they're being taught this, but the understanding that the clients are intuiting is this is the way to do therapy.
Right.
And what I hear you saying is, we can throw that out the window if that's not what's working for the client. It's really about the relationship.
I mean, I'm amazed at how many different perspectives there are and how many different avenues there are. And I'm not talking about whacked out people who are doing crazy stuff. I'm talking about seasoned therapists who are approaching this from, different angles, but there's a commonality there. There's an understanding for how trauma impacts the brain and the body, but they're doing it in different ways, and having an appreciation and an understanding for that, and to be able, as a student, as a newer clinician, to be able to know yourself such that you can say, well, this resonates with me, or that resonates with me. Let me try to pursue that more, learn more about that. I mean, those things are kind of have been coming up a lot as themes.
In terms of Sarah's question, Guy, about the trends, she made a comment about the evidence-based. And I mean, do you hear that coming up on the podcast you do? I mean, are people, because it's, as a trainer, that's a big part of my life now. I'm a trainer, and it's like there's such this resistance in our field and from community health centers. And, it's like, if you're not evidence-based, you don't even exist, basically.
Right.
And I mean, is that what you're hearing? I mean, from the people that you're interviewing on the podcast?
I wouldn't say that. I will say that It's interesting. A lot of the people that I've had on the podcast, a lot of the like huge names like, Bessel van der Kolk or Bruce Perry really share a similar perspective on evidence-based practice, which is for the most part, it's not the end all and be all.
Mhm.
It's certainly not the end all and be all. I was talking to a clinician today who's been doing this for 20 years, who worked with Mary Ainsworth and whose supervisor was Christine Courtois, a very well-respected trauma therapist, who said that evidence-based practice, he had been working with the VA. We're kind of opening up a can of worms here, but he was saying that evidence-based practice in the VA is they're continuing to push these practices that really don't really have the evidence behind them.
Uh-huh.
And what's happening is that a lot of these other modalities aren't getting the attention, aren't getting the funding, and oftentimes people aren't pursuing them in terms of the clinician, aren't practicing them because they're working within a context where they only can, utilize evidence-based practices.
Exactly.
And I want to define for the listener what evidence-based practice is, because I know that my students don't necessarily understand that evidence-based practice essentially means that it's studied by science and it's replicatable. If it's not an evidence-based practice, that doesn't mean that it doesn't work.
Yeah. It's kind of the powers that be that say that this is a model that
Right.
is going to work and is going to get funding, and that's where then
Exactly.
the research goes. And I have this experience that my brother is a physician, and he graduated medical school 25 years ago or whatever that was, 25, 30 years ago. And you might know Dr. Dean Ornish. He was big in, he still is, I think, about teaching about like type A personality and changing diet and things like this, about, helping people that were having cardiovascular disease. So he was the keynote speaker at this really prestigious med school, and he got booed. There was doctors in the crowd that literally booed this guy 25 years ago for saying things like working with a more plant-based diet, things like meditation, yoga. 25 years ago, medical students, medical people booing this guy. And now you can't find a hospital probably in America that doesn't, have some of these things that are integrated into the treatment. And, as someone that's using a model, well, two models, I'm a trainer in both somatic experiencing and NARM, and both models are not fully deemed as evidence-based. And it's so
Right.
frustrating because people are in need. And if things are working, then of course, I understand the value of it, but the hoops that they put and the obstacles they put in the way of
Right.
people who can't afford to go to private practice, they can't afford to do these retreats in, Tulum, Mexico, but they need support to help them address their trauma. And it's so frustrating for me. And it really fuels me to leave my family and go travel all around to try to educate people. And I think that's something all three of us are share. We're all teachers, and we're all, doing these different public service announcements, basically, to kind of help people get the work so that it can help them and help their communities.
I think another side to this is that clients out there oftentimes, I guess what I'm hearing is that clients are ready. Clients are thirsty for whatever's going to help. Oftentimes they don't care whether something's evidence-based, and don't even, quite frankly, don't even know what's evidence-based.
Right.
But they are open, and people are getting helped. But the other side to that is, well, how are these modalities getting out there? What are the spotlights being shined on? And in many
Right.
cases, it is those things evidence-based,
Yeah.
But, with the VA, there's been a lot of research on the benefits of, canines helping people with PTSD. But that, as of this point, it's not evidence-based.
Yeah.
Petting a doggy is not evidence-based, but it works.
Right.
Yeah, when you think of it like that, it makes it sound so ridiculous. There's so many things that humans have been using for
Right.
thousands of years.
Right.
And it's like we're getting in our own way. It really is frustrating in some ways. And also it just, it gives me more fuel to continue to do the work that we're all doing.
Yeah. Well, what is your future vision with your podcast and general engagement in the trauma field?
My future vision for the podcast, I think really just talking more about this. I mean, I love this topic
Yeah.
and continuing to do it. I mean, I just get so excited about this topic because there's something so simple about it. You know, it's creating relationships and the power of relationships,
Yeah.
especially within the context of working with people who've been impacted by trauma. That to me is, I want to be more effective and impactful in that sense. But where do I see my engagement in the trauma field going? You know, I think creating spaces where clinicians can come and stand on that diving board and get to the point where they can, you know, take those steps to walk up to the end of it, to the edge of it. That's what I'd like to do, you know?
Do you ever have meetups?
I haven't.
We
I haven't
should
thus
do
far.
it.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah. Brad, do you have anything to add?
The meetups sound fun, but you know, I'm just really, again, touched, you know, by all that you're sharing. And I think back to like the beginning days of like psychoanalysis, where Freud, you know, was just creating this model, and he had people that were mentoring under him for years and years and years. And they started establishing these communities of people that were all mentoring each other and giving each other support. And we have so lost this in our modern era of like, we're all of us therapists are like on islands with our client, with our very complex clients. When you're working with trauma, you're working with super complex clients. And not only are they complex, but they bring up so much for us, and they're dealing with a lot. And I just think that the value of what you're bringing in terms of both the podcast and your vision, and also it's very aligned with, of course, what we're doing too in NARM, is really creating the power of relationships, creating mentorship so that we have each other's backs, so that when we're sitting there with a really intense client, we feel like we have backing, we have people that are holding us. And I say this in the trainings all the time, but like, we needed this from our parents, and our parents needed this from their parents, and our grandparents needed it from their parents. And if all of that was intact, then we probably wouldn't be spending so much time doing all the work on ourselves that we're now doing. And I think that this is really for, you know, again, I'm just so happy we had you on here, because I know that we share this together, and, you know, we want to continue to promote all of this great stuff you're bringing to our field and to the world. So thanks so much, Guy.
Awesome, man. I appreciate having me on. It was a pleasure talking to you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Sarah, thank you for continuing to be the steward of this. We really appreciate all that you're doing as well. So thank you for being this great host for our podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can go to the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The Transforming Trauma podcast is brought to you by the NARM Training Institute. NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals are offered across North America and internationally.
Please join us starting in June for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. NARM provides a relational approach to addressing the current COVID pandemic and tools to support healing in the aftermath of this collective trauma. Join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online-basics.
Thank you to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.